They say some houses remember, not with walls or wood, but with something deeper, something that waits in the darkness between heartbeats. In 1847, a widow arrived at Black Hollow with nothing but a trunk of her husband's belongings and eyes that had seen too much. Within 3 months, 7 men would be dead. A town would tear itself apart, and the truth would be buried so deep that even God himself seemed to look away. What happened in that cursed valley wasn't just murder. It was something far worse, something that challenged everything the good people of Pennsylvania thought they knew about grief, madness, and the terrible things we do for love. This is the story they tried to erase from history. This is the story of Eleanor Blackwood, and the night Black Hollow learned that some widows don't weep, they hunt. The arrival. The October rain fell like pennies on a coffin lid the day Eleanor Blackwood arrived in Black Hollow. She came on the afternoon coach, a solitary figure in black silk that had long since faded to the color of ash. The driver, a man named Cyrus Webb, who had driven that mountain route for 23 years, would later tell anyone who'd listened that he'd never seen a woman sit so still. Not once during the 8-hour journey from Pittsburgh did she move, not to adjust her skirts, not to wipe the condensation from the window, not even to look at the wild Pennsylvania wilderness rolling past. She simply stared straight ahead with those pale green eyes, her gloved hands folded in her lap, as if she were already a ghost. "Ma'am," Cyrus had said, as they crested the final hill and Black Hollow spread below them like a wound in the valley. "Ma'am, we're here." Eleanor had turned to him then, and Cyrus would remember that moment for the rest of his days. Her face was beautiful in the way that broken things are beautiful, all sharp edges and hollow places where something vital had been carved away. She couldn't have been more than 26, but her eyes belonged to someone much older, someone who had walked through rooms no living person should enter. "Thank you," she'd whispered, and her voice was like wind through a cemetery. Black Hollow in 1847 was not a welcoming place. Nestled in a valley so deep that winter came 6 weeks early and spring 6 weeks late, it was a town of coal miners and mill workers, of hard men and harder women who had learned that the mountain gave nothing without taking something in return. 300 souls called it home, though that number had been slowly dwindling for years as the coal seams ran thin and the young folks fled to Philadelphia and New York, chasing dreams of softer lives. The Blackwood house stood at the edge of town, separated from its nearest neighbor by half a mile of dark pine forest. It was a federal-style home, 2 stories of gray stone with black shutters that hung crooked on their hinges. The locals called it the Mercy House, though no one could quite remember why. It had belonged to Eleanor's late husband's family for 3 generations, passing from father to son like a curse disguised as inheritance. Eleanor's husband, Thomas Blackwood, had died 6 months earlier in Pittsburgh. The official report said it was consumption, that wasting disease that had claimed so many in those years before medicine understood such things. But Eleanor knew better. She had watched Thomas die over the course of 3 agonizing weeks, watched as he grew thinner and paler, watched as he called out names in his sleep, names of people who had been dead for decades, names that made him weep with terror even in his fevered state. On the last night, Thomas had gripped her hand with surprising strength, his eyes wild and rolling like a spooked horse. "Don't go to Black Hollow," he'd gasped. "Eleanor, please, sell the house, burn it to the ground. But don't go there. Don't ever go there." "Why?" she'd asked, smoothing his sweat-soaked hair. "Thomas, what's there?" But he'd only shaken his head over and over until the life went out of him with a final rattling breath that sounded almost like laughter. She'd buried him in Pittsburgh's Allegheny Cemetery under a simple headstone that read, "Beloved Husband," though beloved was a complicated word for what they'd had. They'd married young, as people did in those days, more out of social expectation than love. But Eleanor had been fond of him, in the distant way you might be fond of a familiar landscape. His death had left her alone in a world that had little use for widows, especially young ones with no fortune, no family. So she'd come to Black Hollow. Not because Thomas had left her the house, though he had, but because she had nowhere else to go, and because something in her chest had hollowed out the moment he died, leaving a space where feeling used to be. If she was going to be empty, she reasoned, she might as well be empty somewhere that matched her insides. Mrs. Abigail Crane, the closest thing Black Hollow had to a welcoming committee, met Eleanor at the house with a basket of bread and preserves. She was a stout woman of 50, with iron-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. "Mrs. Blackwood," she said, her voice carefully neutral, "we weren't expecting you until next week. I apologize for any inconvenience," Eleanor replied, taking the basket with hands that trembled slightly. "I found I couldn't bear Pittsburgh any longer. Too many memories." Abigail's expression softened just a fraction. "I lost my Henry to the mines 12 years ago. I understand about memories, child. They can eat you alive if you let them." She helped Eleanor carry her single trunk inside. The house smelled of dust and something else, something sweet and rotten that made Eleanor's stomach turn. Furniture sat shrouded in white sheets like sleeping ghosts. The floorboards creaked in complaint under their feet. "I've had the Anderson boy clean what he could," Abigail said, moving through the rooms and pulling back curtains, letting weak autumn light spill across the floors. "But the house has been empty near on 2 years. Since your husband's uncle passed, it'll need work." Eleanor barely heard her. She was staring at the portrait above the fireplace, a stern-faced man in outdated clothes, his hand resting on the head of a large black dog. The man's eyes seemed to follow her as she moved, and the dog's mouth was pulled back in what could have been a smile or a snarl. "That's Nathaniel Blackwood," Abigail said, following her gaze. "Built this house in 1798. Thomas's great-grandfather. Queer old bird, by all accounts. Came here from Salem after some trouble with the church. Folks said he dabbled in things a Christian man shouldn't dabble in, but you know how people talk." "What kind of things?" Eleanor asked. Abigail's mouth pressed into a thin line. "Old wives' tales and superstition. Nothing a modern woman need worry herself about." But her eyes said something different. Her eyes said run. That first night, Eleanor lay in the upstairs bedroom, Thomas's childhood room, she realized, noting the water-stained, books on the shelf and the faded wallpaper with its pattern of sailing ships. Sleep wouldn't come. The house settled around her with groans and whispers, and somewhere in the walls, mice scratched and scurried. At midnight she heard the first scream. It was distant, muffled, but unmistakably human. Eleanor sat bolt upright, her heart hammering against her ribs. She waited, straining her ears, but heard only the wind in the pines and the ticking of the grandfather clock downstairs. "Just a nightmare," she told herself. "Just the wind. Just your imagination, Eleanor, running wild like it always does." But when she finally drifted off near dawn, she dreamed of Thomas standing at the foot of her bed, his face gray and sunken, earth spilling from his mouth as he tried to speak. And behind him, in the shadows, something else waited. Something with too many teeth and eyes that burned like coals. The next morning, she woke to news that would change everything. Ephraim Potter, the town blacksmith, had been found dead in his shop, his body twisted into an impossible position, his face frozen in an expression of such pure terror that the men who found him had to step out. ID to vomit. Dr. Samuel Harrison, who had seen his share of death in 40 years of practice, could find no cause. No wounds, no poison, no sign of violence except for the fingerprint bruises around Potter's throat. Bruises that seemed too small, too delicate to have come from a man's hands. Like a woman's hands, whispered the men at the general store, where Eleanor had gone to buy supplies. Or a child's. They fell silent when they saw her, this strange widow in her mourning dress, and Eleanor felt their eyes on her back as she paid for her flour and sugar and hurried back to the Mercy house. She told herself it was coincidence. A man had died, yes, but people died every day. It had nothing to do with her, nothing to do with Thomas's fevered warnings, nothing to do with the way the house seemed to breathe at night or the scratching in the walls that sounded almost like words. But that night, she heard the screaming again, and this time it was closer. Over the following weeks, Eleanor tried to settle into some semblance of normal life. She cleaned the house from top to bottom, scrubbing away years of neglect until her hands were raw and bleeding. She walked into town for supplies, enduring the stares and whispered conversations that stopped when she approached. She accepted Abigail Crane's invitations to tea, sitting in parlors with women who smiled with their mouths but not their eyes, who asked polite questions about Pittsburgh while clearly wondering what darkness she'd brought with her from the city, and every few nights another man died. Jeremiah Cooper, the mill foreman, was found floating face down in the creek, though he was known as the strongest sway. Emmer, in the valley. Marcus Webb, Cyrus's nephew, hanged himself in his barn, though his family swore he'd been happy as could be that very morning. Each death was different, each seemingly natural or self-inflicted, but Dr. Harrison saw what others didn't. He saw the pattern in the bruises, the same delicate fingerprints on every throat. He saw the expressions on the dead men's faces, the terror that no natural death could explain. On the night of the third death, he came to the Mercy House. Eleanor answered the door in her nightgown, a candle shaking in her hand. Dr. Harrison stood on her porch, rain streaming from his hat, his medical bag clutched to his chest like a shield. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion and something else, fear. "I need to speak with you. It's urgent." She let him in, of course. What else could she do? They sat in the parlor, the fire casting shadows that danced like demons on the walls. Dr. Harrison was a tall man, gaunt and graying, with eyes that had seen too much suffering. He'd delivered half the babies in Black Hollow and closed the eyes of half the dead. He was not a man given to flights of fancy. "Mrs. Blackwood," he began, then stopped, seeming to struggle with his words. "Eleanor. May I call you Eleanor?" "Of course." "Eleanor, how much did your husband tell you about his family, about this house?" Her mouth went dry. Very little. He rarely spoke of Black Hollow. When he did, it was always with discomfort. Did he ever mention his great-grandfather, Nathaniel Blackwood? She thought of the portrait, those following eyes. Mrs. Crane mentioned him. She said he'd come from Salem, that there were rumors about him. Dr. Harrison leaned forward, his face grave. Nathaniel Blackwood was tried for witchcraft in Salem in 1692. He was acquitted, barely, but asked to leave Massachusetts. He came here and built this house in what was then wilderness. The locals accepted him because he was educated, because he had money, because they needed a doctor. He paused. Because he made them afraid not to accept him. Eleanor's hands had gone cold. "I don't understand. What does this have to do with the deaths?" "Everything, I fear." Dr. Harrison pulled a leather-bound journal from his bag, so old that the cover cracked when he opened it. "This belonged to my grandfather. He was Nathaniel's contemporary. He kept careful records of everything that happened in those early years." He turned pages covered in spidery handwriting. In 1801, 3 years after Nathaniel built this house, strange things began to happen. Livestock died, crops failed, and men started dying, 5 of them over the course of a winter. My grandfather examined the bodies. He noted the same details I've been seeing: the bruises, the expressions of terror, the complete lack of natural cause. "What stopped it?" Eleanor whispered. "Nathaniel did. He performed some kind of ritual, sealed something away. My grandfather wasn't privy to the details, but he noted that the death stopped immediately afterward. Nathaniel died 6 months later, and this house has passed from father to son ever since. Always with the same warning: never let the house sit empty for more than a year." He closed the journal. "Your husband's uncle died 2 years ago. The house has been empty." Eleanor stood, her legs trembling. "You're saying there's something in this house? Something that kills?" "I'm saying that there's a pattern, and you're at the center of it. 5 men dead in 6 weeks, Eleanor. All of them died after you arrived. But I haven't done anything. I've barely left this house. I know that." His voice was gentle now, almost kind. "I don't think you're doing it. I think something is doing it through you or because of you or—" He rubbed his face. "God help me, I don't know. But you need to leave, tonight. Before anyone else dies." Before Eleanor could respond, before she could even process what he was saying, they heard it. The scratching in the walls growing louder, more frantic. And then, clear as a bell in the silence, a voice. "Eleanor." It sounded like Thomas. Dr. Harrison's face went white. "Jesus Christ." "Eleanor," the voice called again, and it was coming from upstairs, from the bedroom where Thomas had slept as a boy. "Eleanor, come here. I need you." She found herself moving toward the stairs, her feet carrying her against her will. Dr. Harrison grabbed her arm. "Don't," he hissed. "Whatever that is, it's not your husband." But she pulled free, because it sounded so much like Thomas, like the Thomas from before the sickness, before the fear. She climbed the stairs one at a time. the doctor following close behind, his breathing harsh and rapid. The bedroom door stood open. Inside, the moonlight falling through the window illuminated an impossible sight. Thomas stood by the window, or something wearing Thomas's shape. He was gray and translucent, and through his chest, Eleanor could see the wallpaper with its faded ships. He turned to her, and his eyes were empty sockets full. Eeping darkness. "You came," he said, and his voice was full of such sadness that Eleanor's heart broke all over again. "I tried to warn you. I tried to keep you away." "Thomas?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "What's happening? What are you—" "I'm what's left," he said. "The house takes us, Eleanor, the Blackwood men. We die, but we don't leave. We can't leave. And when a woman we loved lives here alone, when she grieves, when she's empty inside the way you are now—" He reached toward her with hands that weren't quite solid. "We fill the emptiness. We come back. And we're so hungry." Dr. Harrison pulled Eleanor back into the hallway. "Run," he said. "Go. I'll hold it off." But Thomas, the thing that had been Thomas, smiled, and it was the saddest smile Eleanor had ever seen. "You can't hold off what's already dead, Doctor. And you can't save her. She's ours now. She's been ours since the moment she crossed the threshold." His form began to change, elongating, growing darker. "But we're not the only hungry ones. Are we, Eleanor? You've been so empty since I died, so hollow. You barely eat, barely sleep. Part of you wanted to die too, didn't it? To follow me into the dark?" Eleanor couldn't speak, couldn't move. Because it was true. All of it. "The house feeds on that," Thomas continued. "On grief, on emptiness, on the space where love used to be. It's been feeding on you since you arrived, growing stronger. And when it's strong enough, when you're empty enough, we can come through, all of us. Every Blackwood who ever died here. We can touch the world again. We can feel again. We can kill." "The men," Eleanor breathed. "The ones who died. Why them? Because the—" "Looked at you," Thomas said. And now his voice was a chorus of voices, layered and terrible. "Because they wanted you. Because you're ours and no one else's. Forever." The house began to shake. Plaster fell from the ceiling. The portraits on the walls burst from their frames, revealing not paintings but windows. Windows looking into rooms where pale figures pressed against the glass from the other side, their mouths open in silent screams. Dr. Harrison dragged Eleanor down the stairs, through the parlor, toward the front door, but the door wouldn't open. The windows wouldn't break. The house had sealed itself. "The cellar," Eleanor gasped, remembering something from her cleaning. "There's a root cellar with an outside entrance." They ran through the kitchen, down the narrow stairs into the damp darkness below. Above them the house groaned and settled, and they could hear footsteps, dozens of footsteps, moving through the rooms. The Blackwood dead, all of them awakened, all of them hungry. The cellar door was bolted from the inside, rusted shut. Dr. Harrison threw himself against it once, twice, 3 times. On the 4th try it burst open, and they stumbled out into the night, into the blessed rain and wind. They didn't stop running until they reached Abigail Crane's house, a mile down the road. The next morning, Eleanor sat in Abigail's kitchen, wrapped in a borrowed shawl, while Dr. Harrison explained everything to a gathering of town elders. They listened in silence, their faces skeptical at first, then increasingly troubled. Some believed him, some didn't. But all of them had known the men who died, had seen the terror on their faces. "Burn it, Abigail Crane," said finally, her voice hard as iron. "Burn that cursed house to the ground and salt the earth where it stood." But Eleanor stood, her hands shaking but her voice steady. "No." They all turned to stare at her. "No," she repeated. "If we burn it, we release them. All of them. They'll scatter into the woods, into the town. You'll never be free of them." She looked at Dr. Harrison. "Your grandfather wrote that Nathaniel sealed something away. The ritual. Is it in the journal?" He nodded slowly. "The instructions are there, but Eleanor, it's dangerous. It requires a Blackwood blood relation. It requires a sacrifice," she finished. "I know. I felt it in the house. It wants me. It's been calling to me since I arrived." She smiled, and it was a smile that would have broken Thomas's heart if he'd still had one. "I'm already empty, Doctor, already half dead. Might as well make it mean something." And that's how, on a cold November morning, 1847, Eleanor Blackwood walked back into the Mercy House for the last time. The sealing. The ritual required 7 days of preparation. 7 days during which Eleanor lived in the cursed house with only Dr. Harrison's visits to keep her tethered to the world of the living. The townspeople of Black Hollow watched from a distance, building barriers of salt and iron around their homes, keeping their children inside after dark. No more men died, but that was only because Eleanor forbade anyone to come near the house except the doctor. She spent those days reading Nathaniel Blackwood's journals, thin volumes Dr. Harrison had retrieved from the town's historical archives, written in a cramped, paranoid hand that grew increasingly frantic. Toward the end, the story they told was more terrible than she'd imagined. Nathaniel hadn't been fleeing Salem's witch trials. He'd been escaping something far worse, something he'd summoned during a midnight ritual in the woods outside the town, something that had killed his wife and 2 children before he'd managed to bind it. The binding had required their deaths, their sacrifice, and in his grief and madness, Nathaniel had built the Mercy House as a prison, not for the thing he'd summoned, but for himself and his bloodline. "We are the locks," he'd written in his final entry. "Our blood is the key. The house feeds on us, and in feeding, it keeps the darkness contained. Should the line ever die, should the house ever stand truly empty, the walls will crack, and what sleeps beneath will wake hungry." Eleanor understood now. The thing in the house wasn't the Blackwood dead. They were merely symptoms, ghosts caught in the gravitational pull of something much older and darker. They were the echoes of men who had died trying to maintain the seal, generation after generation, their spirits trapped in an endless cycle of sacrifice and suffering. And Thomas, poor Thomas, who had fled to Pittsburgh, thinking distance would save him. But the blood called to blood, and the house had found him anyway, had hollowed him out from the inside until there was nothing left but a shell and a warning. On the 7th night, Eleanor prepared herself according to the ritual's instructions. She bathed in water mixed with salt and sage. She dressed in white linen. She cut her hair short and burned it in the fireplace, whispering the words Nathaniel had written. And then, as midnight approached, she descended into the cellar where no one had set foot in decades. The root cellar's back wall was false. Behind it lay a chamber carved from living rock, and in the center of that chamber sat a well. Not for water, but for something else. The air around it rippled like heat waves, and Eleanor could feel it pulling at her, drawing her closer. Dr. Harrison had wanted to come with her, but she'd refused. This was Blackwood business. Blackwood blood, Blackwood burden. She knelt before the well, the ritual knife cold in her hand, a blade that had been passed down through generations, its edge still sharp, its handle worn smooth by desperate fingers. According to Nathaniel's instructions, she needed to speak 3 truths, make 3 cuts, and offer 3 drops of blood to seal the well for another generation. But Eleanor had no intention of sealing it for just another generation. "I am Eleanor Blackwood," she said, her voice echoing in the chamber. "I am the last of the line." From the well came a sound like breathing, like wind through a vast underground canyon. "I am alone," she continued. "My husband is dead. I have no children, and I will bear no children. When I die, the blood dies with me." The breathing grew louder, more excited. "And I offer you a bargain." The well went silent. Eleanor stood, the knife trembling in her hand. "You want blood. You want sacrifice. You've been fed on Blackwood blood for 150 years, and it's kept you contained. But you're still hungry. You'll always be hungry. There will never be enough." She took a step closer to the edge. "So I give you everything, all of me. My blood, my bones, my spirit. I'll feed myself to you, and in return you will sleep. Not for a generation. Forever." From the darkness of the well something laughed. It sounded like breaking glass and tearing meat. "Foolish woman," a voice said, and it came from everywhere and nowhere. "What makes you think your single life is worth more than the generations that have fed me? Because I'm choosing it," Eleanor said. They were all trying to escape. They were all running, fighting, forcing the seal to hold while they lived in fear. But I'm walking in willingly. I'm giving myself completely, and that changes everything. She could feel Thomas now, his spirit hovering at the edge of the chamber, unable to enter this sacred space. "Don't," his voice whispered. "Eleanor, please. There's another way." "There isn't," she said softly. "You know there isn't. How many more generations, Thomas? How many more men dying in fear, women left alone, children growing up in a cursed house? It ends with me. It has to." She raised the knife to her throat. "Wait." Dr. Harrison's voice came from the cellar stairs. He stood there, ancient and trembling, holding a lantern. "Eleanor, I can't let you do this. You're young. You could still have a life." "What life?" She smiled at him, and there were tears on her cheeks. "I'm already a ghost doctor. I've been one since Thomas died. Let me at least be a useful one." She made the first cut. Blood welled hot and red, dripping down her white dress. The well began to glow with a sickly green light. The chamber shook. She made the second cut. The light grew brighter. Shadows peeled away from the walls, revealing impossible geometries, angles that hurt to look at, spaces that folded in on themselves. From the depths of the well came the sound of something vast stirring. Dr. Harrison started down the stairs. "Eleanor, stop!" She made the third cut. And then she stepped forward, into the well, into the darkness that had no bottom. The fall lasted forever and no time at all. Eleanor felt herself unraveling, her body coming apart like threads pulled from a tapestry. But instead of fear, she felt something else: relief. The emptiness that had consumed her since Thomas's death was finally being filled, but not with grief or longing, with purpose, with ending. She could see them now, all the Blackwood dead, stretching back through generations. Nathaniel with his haunted eyes, Thomas's grandfather, who had hanged himself in this very house, Thomas himself reaching for her with translucent hands. They were all trapped here, all suffering, all bound by blood and duty in the terrible weight of inherited sin. "I'm sorry," she told them as she fell. "I'm sorry you had to carry this. But I'm ending it now. Rest. Finally, rest." The darkness at the bottom of the well opened like a mouth, and Eleanor Blackwood fell into it. Dr. Harrison stood at the edge of the well, his heart hammering, watching the green light fade. The chamber grew quiet, the shadows retreated, and slowly, impossibly, the stone around the well began to seal itself, rock flowing like water until there was no opening, no entrance, no way in or out. He climbed back up the stairs, through the cellar, through the empty house that already felt different, lighter, cleaner, as if a fever had broken. When he emerged into the cold November dawn, Abigail Crane and half the town were waiting in the yard, their faces pale and worried. "Is it done?" Abigail asked. Dr. Harrison nodded, unable to speak. "And Eleanor?" He shook his head. They buried an empty coffin in the Black Hollow Cemetery 3 days later, under a headstone that read Eleanor Blackwood, beloved wife, 1821 to 1847. Dr. Harrison spoke at the service. Though he couldn't remember later what he'd said, he remembered only the way the sunlight fell through the bare November trees, and the fact that for the first time in weeks, he slept without nightmares. The Mercy House stood empty for 3 more years before the town council voted to tear it down. They salvaged what they could, the good timber, the stones, the iron fittings, and distributed them throughout Black Hollow to build new homes, barns, and shops. Some protested, saying it was bad luck to spread the cursed house throughout the town. But Dr. Harrison argued that the curse was broken, that Eleanor's sacrifice had purified the place, and he was right. No more strange deaths plagued Black Hollow. The crops grew again. The mines hit new seams of coal. Young people stopped fleeing, and some even returned. Years passed. The story of Eleanor Blackwood faded into legend, then into rumor, then into nothing. Dr. Harrison died in 1873, taking most of the truth with him. The journals he'd kept, Nathaniel's writings, his grandfather's observations, his own careful documentation, were lost in a fire that consumed his office. By the turn of the century, no one in Black Hollow remembered the Mercy House or the widow who had disappeared one November night. The town prospered and grew, spread beyond the valley, became something modern and bright. The old ways, the old fears, were forgotten. But sometimes on cold autumn nights when the wind blows down from the mountains, The people of what is now called simply Hollow will pause and listen to a sound that has no source. A sound like a woman singing, very far away, a lullaby in a language no one speaks anymore. And they'll feel, just for a moment, a presence watching over them. Not threatening, not hungry. Protective. In the archives of the Pennsylvania Historical Society, there's a single document that mentions the Blackwood case, a letter written by a coal merchant who passed through Hollow in 1903. He wrote, "Strangest thing, the locals here believe their town is guarded by a ghost. A widow, they say, who gave up everything to save them. They leave flowers sometimes at an empty grave. I asked why they honor someone who isn't really buried there, and an old woman told me, 'She's not in the grave, mister. She's in the ground, she's in the stones of our houses and the iron of our gates. She's everywhere and nowhere. She's what stands between us and the dark.'" Superstitious nonsense, of course, but it's touching in its way. The letter writer was wrong, of course. It wasn't superstitious nonsense. Because deep beneath what used to be the Mercy House, deep in rock and earth and darkness, Eleanor Blackwood keeps her eternal vigil. She is the seal and the sealed, the lock and the key, the sacrifice that doesn't end. The thing in the well still hungers, will always hunger, but it cannot rise. She won't let it. She is alone in the dark, but she is not empty. She is full of purpose, full of strength, full of the fierce protective love that comes from choosing to stand between the innocent and the terrible. She is the wall against which the darkness breaks. She is the guardian at the gate. She is the widow of Black Hollow, and she will never rest. But that's not the end of the story. Because in 2024, a young woman named Emma Blackwood, a descendant of Thomas's brother, who had fled Black Hollow before all this happened, moved back to the town that's now simply called Hollow. She's renovating an old house on the edge of town, and she's been having dreams. Dreams of a woman in white, standing at the edge of a dark well, whispering a warning. The construction crew found something last week while digging the new foundation. A chamber, a sealed chamber carved from rock, and inside that chamber, a well. They've asked Emma what she wants to do about it. She doesn't know yet, but she's been seeing a man lately, a kind man, a local historian who knows things he shouldn't know, who has eyes that seem much older than his face. He's been telling her stories about the town, about its history, about the widow who saved them all. "Don't open the well," he tells her, and his voice sounds like October rain on a coffin lid. "Please, whatever you do, don't open the well." But Emma can hear something down there, in the dark, something calling her name, something that sounds almost like her own voice, echoing back through time. And every night, the voice grows louder. The message, some sacrifices echo through generations. Eleanor Blackwood gave everything, her life, her rest, her very soul, not for glory or recognition, but to break a cycle of suffering that had consumed her family for over a century. Her story reminds us that true courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the willingness to walk into the darkness so others can live in the light. We all inherit something from those who came before us. Sometimes it's wealth or wisdom, and sometimes it's pain or burden. Eleanor teaches us that we have a choice in what we pass forward. We can continue the cycles, or we can be the generation that breaks them, no matter the cost. Her lonely vigil in the dark, standing between the living and the hungry void, is the ultimate expression of selfless love. She asks for nothing in return. She expects no gratitude. She simply stands, eternal and unyielding, because someone has to. In our own lives, we may never face supernatural horrors or ancient curses, but we all face moments when we must decide, do we run from the darkness, or do we confront it? Do we pass our burdens to the next generation, or do we shoulder them ourselves? Do we choose the easy path or the right one? Eleanor chose, and in choosing, she transformed from a grieving widow into something greater, a guardian, a protector, a light in the darkness. We should all be so brave. We should all love so fiercely. We should all be willing to stand in the dark if that's what it takes to keep others safe. That's Eleanor's legacy. That's what the widow of Black Hollow left behind. Not fear, not horror. Hope.